I believe you're destined to meet certain people. You're destined to have certain experiences in life.
There's a difference between being connected and actual connection.
Honestly, communication can fix almost anything.
If you're not living in the present moment, you could go back on it.
I don't believe in soulmates. Some relationships, some people, some connections are meant to stay around forever and traverse different chapters of your life, and some are meant to kind of come in and go out.
I don't want people to solve my problems. Like, sometimes I just want to be heard.
We expect people to know what they want to do for the rest of their lives. Most people don't know what the hell they want for lunch.
Such a piece of it that we often help people through things that we've been through ourselves and are able to impart that wisdom. It's not about fixing. The more fear you have, the more you're meant to do it.
Stop looking for validation in other people. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, listen to it.
We do touch on some heavy topics, and you can always check the description for more details on this episode. The Turtz podcast and content in this episode is presented solely for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. Neither I nor my guests are healthcare or mental health care providers, and we are not licensed or authorized to provide professional medical advice. For more information, please see our policy at TURTZED.com.
From intuition that opened family secrets, he unlocked his passion and purpose for helping others discover their own inner wisdom. Terence, welcome to TURTZED.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I am very appreciative that you were open to having this conversation. I think the inner wisdom and gut instincts are so crucial for everyone. Your perspective that you're not just here to help someone by being able to understand it from an intuition perspective, but really helping people unlock their own inner wisdom is, to me, really important, because I think for a long time I've blocked my own. I didn't block it. I just ignored it.
Most people do. Most people, they bury that part of themselves. As they get older, children are extremely intuitive. And as you get older, you learn the rights and wrongs of society, and you stop listening to your gut. And I think that that's a big mistake. I think that if everyone kind of listened to that feeling, I think that people also confuse what goes on in their brain and what goes on in their heart with their gut, and people need to trust themselves a little bit more.
When you think about your personal earliest memory of trusting your gut, where you felt a clear vision, what did that look like?
Like my earliest memory of trusting my gut was stupid things that got me in trouble. Was things like, open the garage, look in here. Why? I don't know. Well, there were Christmas presents, for some reason one day I would kind of just daze out. And one day I was sitting there and all of a sudden I grabbed my mother's car keys and I went out and I opened up the trunk of her car. And there was a stack of birthday presents. And I was like, what? I felt like I hit the jackpot. I got yelled at, but I always kind of knew things that I shouldn't. I would say things and I would get yelled at for talking about adult things. And I'm like, but what are you talking about? As a kid, you don't have that filter. You don't know what is right and what is wrong to say.
Mm-hmm.
You just kind of roll with it.
I think for a lot of people, ignoring intuition, just even feeling their own emotions, adults can often stifle that in the sense of, if you're feeling overwhelmed as a kid, a parent could say, it's not that big of a deal.
I'll give you something to cry about. There's a lot of ways that people deal with things that are harmful.
As you were having these, I'll say, adult conversations where you were pointing things out, it could have been really easy for you to just let go of these gut instincts and say, you know what, these get me in trouble, I'm stepping away.
Absolutely. But one thing that happened, I was sitting at the breakfast table with my grandmother. I was probably about 7, 8 years old, and my mom and her boyfriend at the time were away on a trip. And I went into that weird state where I just kind of was dazed out. My grandmother was I can remember her sitting at the stove making me pancakes. And I grabbed a picture of my mom and her boyfriend off the refrigerator, and I took a knife and I ran the knife between the two of them and literally cut the picture without cutting the paper. And my grandmother was flipped out and was like, why would you do that? And my grandfather, went off the rails. And shortly after that, my mom and her boyfriend broke up. And I was like, don't worry, that's not going to be the end, but and they a year later got back together and they're married almost 35 years. Like I always knew that there was going to be a rough patch for them, but that it would work out. And when they first met, I was that kid. I would show up, but he actually, after him and my mom broke up, he was living actually in our neighborhood. He had rented an apartment from a family friend of ours. And I used to show up at his doorstep. Be like, no, this guy needs to stay familiar because he's going to be a big part of our lives. So me and my best friend who would ride our bikes up there and knock on his door and be like, hi, what are you doing? And now he's the greatest father figure, that you could hope for.
It's so interesting that at such a young age, you had such a distinct wisdom about these things.
I didn't see it as wisdom. I just I didn't understand it for years. And I would always say things like, my life has always been a little weird. I grew up, a good friend of my family's was a anchor woman for CBS News. And she was Aunt Michelle, to me. And we were super close. And like breaks from school, she'd fly me up to her house in New Hampshire, on Golden Pond, literally like 4 houses from where the movie was filmed. And I would come back to school and they'd be like, write an essay. And I'd write these essays and they'd be like, you're a liar. I'd be like, no. Like these things actually happened to me. Or I would talk about intuition. I would talk about things and they would tell me I was crazy. So I've always kind of seen it differently.
How did you balance that internally when you felt like people were calling you crazy on one level, but you also weren't wrong on another?
The same way I do nowadays when a client looks at me and goes, you're nuts. That's never going to happen. Okay, fine. I trust myself,
Where did that trust come from?
Seeing the outcomes, having a feeling and learning. Like in my teen years, it was I'd have this feeling and be like, nah, and I'd go ahead with something anyway. And I'd be like, fuck, this is why I shouldn't have done this. This is why I had that feeling. I had to like build all these meanings for the feelings and the things I would feel or see or smell or taste, and seeing it all work out, seeing relationships that should never have stood the test of time work out, helping people deal with grief or breakups or tough situations, or even cautioning someone in a bad relationship and saying, hey, you shouldn't be in this as much as you want to be. This isn't good for you. And then watching why and being able to be there for them through it. Like that built the trust that I have in myself.
As you think about people who just gets a gut instinct and ignores it.
But that gut instinct is intuition. Regardless, everyone is intuitive. This is not something that I can do, you can't do. Just, I can't hit a baseball the way someone else can. I can't draw the way some of my friends can. Everyone has different strengths. It is something that fortunately, I've always had this really strong gut instinct, but I've leaned into it my whole life. And that's made it stronger and easier to trust.
What advice would you give someone to lean into that and trust it more?
Stop looking for validation in other people. Trust your gut. If something feels wrong, listen to it. People are afraid of being disappointed, afraid of being hurt, that they do things, they sabotage themselves, they run from opportunity. I can't stop a person.
It's so interesting because I think when you talk about it, and I think the baseball example was a really good one, in my mind, there are moments where I'll say like, this is what's going to happen if we do this. This is what's going to happen if we do that. And I think that as I've grown up, I've always struggled to articulate it in a way because I don't want it to come off as cocky or know it all, but I just sort of can look at the bigger picture and say like, these are the 2 ways that I see this playing out based on what decision we make today. And I think your concept of baseball, where it's like some people are better at baseball than others or any sport, right? It kind of takes away this mystery of, as a kid, like, how could you know that, right? And almost as a active practice. And I think when you, at the end of what you said, where you were talking about really being able to trust yourself and know that you're not looking for validation in others, it's such a trajectory away from the baseball analogy. And yet it really does hold true, because I think that's the piece of life, as you described it, that gets chipped away. That sort of, we're looking for that validation of others. And it's interesting because as a kid, I'm like, oh, but like, wouldn't you look for that more because you have your parents and all these other aspects of being a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old? But no, it really is almost the opposite, where like the older you get, the less you trust your gut, the more external validation you're going to look for.
Absolutely. But, you know, like even just the way people are raised nowadays compared to like, 40 years ago, as a kid, I ran around, I, was told to come home when the streetlights came on, and, kids nowadays are so controlled, people nowadays are so controlled. And I think that screws with that gut instinct.
Tell me a little bit more about that, because I have a picture in my mind of what that is. I'm thinking of like the meal prepping and the gym and the this and the that.
Absolutely. Everyone's got a routine. Everyone has their order for life, and I think that kind of messes with it. I try not to plan as much as possible. Outside of my daily schedule with work, my appointment book, I try not to plan too far in advance because I like to roll with things. You miss out on a lot of opportunities when you're overthinking things.
Yeah, literally, because you could overthink past the timeline of being able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you got older and were able to better understand your intuition, how did that turn into helping other people?
So when I was about 14, I started doing readings for friends. I would throw cards for friends. I would talk to them about what I felt. The cards for me have always been like fun artwork to look at. They don't really tell me anything. I've never learned tarot. I used a deck of playing cards for years. And for me to keep my brain busy so I could talk about what I felt, I would do the math. So I'd sit there and I would create equations and play with the numbers in my head to keep myself busy. And I started doing readings for a friend, and one day her mother approached me and was like, hey, what do you think about me? And I was, I told her, I said, I see a car accident, but I don't think it's going to be a bad thing. No big deal. Tell her, a bunch of stuff. And then later on, she has the car accident. It was a rollover. It was a bad accident. And after getting out of the hospital, the reason I didn't think it was going to be so bad was because I saw the same car. Well, her husband went out and bought her the exact same car while she was in recovery, so like, yeah, there's, I'm interpreting a feeling, a taste, a smell, a whole bunch of different things to give a client or a friend or someone whoever I'm talking to build this picture for them. Mm-hmm. It's like a puzzle.
As you start to put that puzzle together for people, how do you balance, in this case, sharing what you sort of feel or see with them interpreting it as fact?
That's tough because I've had to create some strict boundaries with certain people because people get addicted to what I do. They, you get people that want to talk to me every minute, I mean, I couldn't tell you how many times I walk out of an event or out of a session and someone's like, well, I just want to adopt you. I want you to move in with me. I'm like, yeah, no, that's never going to happen.
Like that's kidnapping.
It's like, you need to trust yourself. Mm-hmm. You should take the guidance, what I'm giving you, and apply it to your life. Mm-hmm. That's it.
It goes back to what you said in the beginning about how trusting your inner wisdom. Mm-hmm. And if you're playing Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and you want to phone a friend, right? You're the friend they get to phone for 30 seconds, but it's 30 seconds.
I'd be the worst friend to phone for 30 seconds.
No, but that concept, right? Like the idea that in a situation you can phone a friend, but that friend can't be with you for the whole game. And I think that idea of it, I guess it balances out that idea of you helping people understand their own gut instincts and their own intuition to help find that inner wisdom.
Yeah. And that's why I give everyone a chance to ask questions at the end of their sessions to say like, all right, is there something you wanted to get out of this? Or is there something I said that I could go further into depth with you? Or most times, at the end of a session, everyone's like, no, you kind of answered, you hit on everything that I wanted to talk about, and that's what I do. But I give everyone the chance to say, like, to work through with me how to apply what I've said, what I've seen.
As you think about that within your own life, is there a time where you ignored your own intuition?
I still do.
What did you learn from ignoring your intuition?
Have patience with myself. Everyone makes mistakes. We're all human. It's about what the motivation is. It's about where it's coming from. Is it coming from a place of love? Is it coming from your ego? You have to figure that out.
How do you start to piece that together for yourself?
I'm a pretty secure person. Everyone has their insecurities. Everyone, picks themselves apart in the mirror. I don't give myself that time. I don't, I as guilty as the next person of, sitting there obsessively taking selfies or messing with my hair in the mirror. But like, I try not to second guess things. I always, if I make a plan, I don't go back on it. Like you were messaging me this morning asking if, we were still on. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, I was actually in the middle of like trying to pick out an outfit, I'm not the best follow through with certain things. Sometimes it can take me a while to get back to a person or to answer a question or whatever. But if once I commit to something, I just I follow through with it. I find that when you second guess opportunities in your life is where things tend to go wrong.
It is another interesting one because even if you listen to your gut, if you're not living in the present moment, you could go back on it. And it's very easy to undo a decision. I find that
the most important experiences, the best opportunities drive that fear response. Like getting on the plane to Salt Lake City a year ago, I was like, why am I doing this? What about this? Like, I don't even like this genre of entertainment. Like, why am I doing this? What, and it freaked me out. And I gotta tell you, I made some great relationship. It was a great opportunity. Everything, even like meeting a client, I meditate every morning on like my appointment book. I'll look at each and every name and kind of sit there and like, what do I think before I even hear their tone, before I even get on a video call, before that person even walks into my space. And the ones that I'm like, I don't want to do this. I learned years ago that like, no, those are the ones I'm going to make a connection with. Those are the ones that like, for some reason, it's activating my fear response because I already feel something that I don't want to admit. I need to shut myself up.
What do you make of that? That it's often seems like the more fear you have, the more you're meant to do it.
I don't know that it's the more fear you have, the more you're meant to do it. I think it's I think your body, I think your soul knows that it's important. And that it's a step you need to take. And I don't believe in letting fear get in the way of things when it comes to relationships or friendships or family, anything. You got to live in the moment and handle things and be respectful. And honestly, communication can fix almost anything. And I wasn't always so communicative. I still have a hard time relating my feelings to, or expressing them to other people. But I have to challenge myself because if I don't grow, I can't help. That's why I don't watch television. I read, I listen to books. I watch movies. I love getting lost in a story. And I'd rather be learning because if I have at least even the smallest bit of knowledge on a subject, it helps me be able to talk about it, to feel it, to, when it comes up around a client or when it comes up around someone that's asking for my help, I can actually talk about it, So I'm constantly always building my knowledge. I'm always reading or watching a documentary or doing something that's going to teach me something new.
As you think about that idea of meant to be and leaning into it rather than pulling away, how do you reframe that for yourself as you're going through it, or destined?
I believe you're destined to meet certain people. You're destined to have certain experiences in life. there's certain things that are unavoidable, and they're going to happen until you learn what you need to learn from that experience. But, I tell people all the time, I don't believe in soulmates. I don't believe there's one person for every person out there, because I've been in this situation hundreds of times. Person is in a happy place, a great relationship. They have the perfect family for all intents and purposes, and their partner passes away and they meet someone else, and that person fills that same spot, or, a similar spot in their life. How does one take away from the other? Does that mean that the first person wasn't the soulmate? No, I believe that everyone's got million soulmates. I believe everyone's got different people that are meant to come in and out of your life. You're meant to learn something. You're meant to grow. Some relationships, some people, some connections are meant to stay around forever and traverse different chapters of your life. And some are meant to kind of come in and go out, so like destiny, I think is something. It's tough. I think that the specifics aren't necessarily there. You're destined to do something in a specific area, fine. But I think there's a million ways to get from point A to point B.
I guess it depends on whether or not you go back on plans or commit. There's all different variations.
I can say that I've said to, and that's what clients tell me all the time. Well, you told me this was going to happen in October, but it happened October 4 years later. Well,
it's still October.
I'm not Google Calendar, it is what it is. There are some times where like, I just know something so specific when I'm giving timing to someone, I'm seeing it based on colors. A lot of what I see is colors. I'll see literal images. I'll see clips that play like a movie in my head. I will, when it comes to like addiction, I will literally taste things and know that like this taste corresponds to this medication or this drug or this, food. And I kind of go from there.
As you're doing this work, when do you feel most aligned? Like that you're doing what feels most purposeful for you?
As someone who's always kind of struggled with depression and body dysmorphia and self-confidence, I think that helping someone repair those parts of themselves. I love working with people that suffer from OCD, because there's always something driving it. And most of the time they have no clue what it is. And I love helping people figure out their little quirks and embrace them. It's not about fixing it. It's about embracing it. It's about saying, you know what, I'm a little crazy. I think we all are.
I love that perspective because, one, I completely agree with you. When you work with people in any capacity, one-on-one, there is such a piece of it that we often help people through things that we've been through ourselves and are able to impart that wisdom. And it's not about fixing. Yeah, it's about alignment.
It's not possible that I could have every experience under the sun, but I want to know about as much as I possibly can, because it's still 30 years into this journey for me. There are still days where I will see something around a client and they're like, am I stumping you? Am I too hard? I'm like, no. I just have to figure out how to put the puzzle together. You got to give me a second, calm down. Don't rush me.
Yeah. It is interesting because the world is ever changing and things are, new things are occurring, or you might encounter someone who's had an experience that you didn't know anything about. And so by continuing to learn and be open to everything, right? Like learning is such a crucial part of being able to help other people because it gives you that understanding.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and understanding people is the first step to healing, It's the first step to getting what you need out of life.
Well, understanding yourself to start.
Yeah.
What is something that has surprised you in working with people?
How much they change what I say to them.
Their own interpretation.
Yeah, they hear what they want to a lot of times.
It's all about perception, right? So you can be as clear as you want, A plus B equals C, but they might still hear the Pythagorean theorem. So like, how does that play into the work that you do with people?
Well, a lot of times, especially, long-term clients, like I've had to clarify and be like, no, that's not what I said. I call it out. I'll ask them questions. Like, why is that what you got out of what we talked about? And then try to figure out what it is, because there's something else blocking the message getting through the way it was meant.
On a different sort of side of the way that you work with people, you obviously want to help people understand themselves better. And you're there to not tell them what to do or how to do it or how things exactly are going to play out.
No, every day someone wants me to tell them whether they should pursue a relationship or end a relationship. I'm like, no, I won't do that. I don't want that weight on my soul. I will tell you why I think this is not good for you, but you've got to decide whether or not you want to endure this.
So what do you want people to take away from a session with you?
I want them to walk away and feel confident. I want them to fix relationships. I want them to work on things. I want them to stop running in fear from things that are actually great from them.
How has that played a role in your life for your own growth?
There was a point in time, I've been doing interviews for years, but there's a point in time where like it used to scare the crap out of me, and I would ignore emails. I would ignore people reaching out that wanted to talk to me, like, no, I just want to work and leave me alone. It's made me more open, especially in my 40s. I'm more like, I don't try not to say no to anything. I have to look at the constraints of my life, but every experience is something that I want to have, especially when it comes to important people in my life. Like there's nothing more important to me than connection.
As you think about connection and communication and interviews specifically, what was the fear behind not wanting to do the interviews?
There's that like inner voice that tells you like, are you a fraud? Like, I kind of like, I've always for years I battled with that. It was like, why do I know these things? Why? Like, I just sit here and I talk to people and I get phone calls or emails or text messages daily about the things that I said that happened. And I'm like, but why me? And I had to come to terms with that from a young age and be like, just what I was put here for.
Is it okay if I share something that you shared with me when we were before the interview? We connected and we were talking, and mid conversation, you had mentioned the dancer, and in my head, I immediately
changing the subject.
What?
I'm really good at changing the subject.
Yes, but what was so interesting was that I immediately went to the podcast episode that I did with someone who was a dancer, and I think for me, in that moment, it wasn't even crossing my mind that it could be anything different.
And I was sitting there going, oh, wait, I don't think he realizes that I changed tracks.
Yes. But when we talked about it and I realized that it was my grandmother, there was something about the way that you communicated it. And we had something in common that we spent every Wednesday with our grandparents.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the biggest connection of them all, because I actually told my mom about our conversation. And I literally said immediately after saying it, I've never talked about Wednesdays before on the podcast. Like, there'd be no way for him to know that.
So for me, I grew up, my grandparents were like, they were like alternative parents, and my grandfather and I were thick as thieves. We did everything together. So like Wednesdays, going through shopping with my grandmother or going out to lunch with her, that was a special thing. And we had, especially after my grandfather passed, such a strong relationship. And the sense that I got that day was just this like warm, like a hug, this warm sense of love that you needed to know was still around you. Whether you realize it or, we block that stuff out. We don't like to think about our heartbreaks and our losses. And I want people to realize that, like, just because a person's not here doesn't mean that they're not still connected, that the energy is not still there. That energy doesn't disappear. It transforms. And that's what we're doing our whole lives. So why is it so hard for people to believe that when you die, that energy is still somewhere? that soul, that connection, those memories, that like, it took a long time for me to figure out that part of me, and why I would say things. I was doing a Halloween party probably about 20 years ago, upstate New York, and it was this big old house, and I'm sitting, and it was just fun. I was just excited to be there. It came through a client, and I didn't know these people from a hole in the wall. I walked in, and I don't do Halloween. I'm not the one who's out there planning costumes for months. I am just who I am. And I'm sitting there through this session, and I'm like, and I brought up a name, and this woman just looked at me and she's like, I don't want to talk about that. I'm like, well, I need to talk about it because it's not going to leave me alone. And I said, I just need you to know that your uncle's around you, and he didn't do what he's being accused of doing. No idea what I'm saying. No idea why I'm going there. And I said to this woman, I said, he was accused of hurting your sister. And she started crying. And I was like, okay, what the hell am I doing? Like, this is everyone's drinking. This is a light, fun party, and I'm bringing the mood down. And I was like, all right. I was like, but I need to get this out. And I said to her, I said, he didn't do what he is being accused of. Apparently, the uncle was very wealthy, and he had passed away. And her sister, who had cut off the whole family, came back out of nowhere and basically tried to guilt the whole family into signing over their inheritance from the wealthy uncle to her because he had, abused her sexually as a child. And there was no proof of it. There was no nothing. And I said to the girl, I said, I need you to know I believe this energy and it didn't happen, but he keeps showing me a calendar. You need to look at the calendar because the timeline doesn't match up. All the accusations all happened while the guy was living out of the country, working for the government in Europe. So they were able to go back, and right before they had all signed over their inheritance, millions of dollars to this woman who had abandoned the family and wanted nothing to do with them for years and wouldn't tell anyone why. She came back with these accusations to try to steal all this money. And I was able to help this family, who none of them were wealthy. This was the only person in the family who he had struck it big, and he was the only person that had anything. So they all kind of were like, this is going to save us all. And she tried to take it. And with that one conversation, I was able to stop it. That's why I do what I do. I love being able to help people.
I want to go back to something because I think it relates to this. I think for me personally, I am really good at solving problems for other people. Whatever context you want to put on that, you can put it on it. But I'm really good when it comes to other people. And I think what's so interesting about what you just said and what we were talking about before I had brought up my grandmother was trusting yourself in your own life versus trusting yourself when it is even more difficult because you're sharing something with someone that is unbelievably difficult and just not backing away from it. And when I started the podcast, talked about there was two Charlies. There was the business Charlie, the Charlie that showed up at the workplace every day. And then there was personal Charlie that was a completely different person that like you wouldn't think, like if you met me in the two different circumstances and didn't know that I wasn't a twin, you'd think I was two different people. You've obviously put in the work, both in the workplace to be able to understand what you're seeing, but also into yourself. And I'd be curious how you navigate bringing them together as one and sort of trusting yourself in the same way for your own personal self.
Whether in my regular life or my career, I'm just always me. I'm a moody bitch and there's nothing, I'm not always the same person, but I'm always coming from the same place. I internalize things. I do everything that everyone else does. What's helped me the most, I think, is therapy. I think everyone needs an outlet. I personally believe that everyone should be forced to do therapy from like 16 to 22. Those are the years that I don't care who you are, what your family believes, everyone needs someone to talk to. And those are the years where we expect people to know what they want to do for the rest of their lives. Most people don't know what the hell they want for lunch.
It's so true. And it's, I think for me, therapy was always this, I have these problems and I have to solve them. And I think there were those for sure. But there was also a level of, even once I solved the problems, like the immediate, the trauma, whatever, like the big ticket items, I think that there's always inner work.
Yeah.
There's always a way to look at the things that we do and reflect on them. And even if it's one small step in a different direction, being able to reflect and say, if this were to happen again, or a situation like this were to happen again tomorrow, I might handle it a little differently because I've had time to reflect. Yeah. And I think that presence, if you will, that you talked about earlier, you kind of get in a therapy session that you don't get in the ordinary world, right? You put your phone away. It's one-on-one. It's a connected moment. And I think that therapy is unbelievably helpful. And also relationships, whether it's romantic, whether it's family, whether it's friends. I think part of the reason why I wanted to start the podcast was because I felt like the kid alone in their room that like only had a connection through a computer. Like I grew up with AIM and all of these things that were relatively new. And even posting on social media is difficult for me because I like having the connection. Like I like that. And I think the world doesn't have enough of it.
I was thinking about that on the drive here today. I'm like, I love social media in certain aspects. Yeah. I love taking pictures. I love beauty. I love nature. I think that people are so connected these days through these devices and they see that as connection, but there's the one-on-one connection is greatly lost.
There's a difference between being connected and actual connection.
Absolutely.
As you think about the work from a broader perspective, where everyone gets a little bit more in touch with their own intuition and more in touch with themselves, what do you think that would do to the world as an impact if everyone had just a touch more of being connected to themselves and their intuition?
I think there'd be a lot more kindness. I think that people would think things through differently. I think that people would understand each other better. And that's the kind of thing that I would love to bring to the world.
It's amazing how understanding can truly change the impact of someone's life. And it's not always with words. Mm-hmm. It might be with actions of just being in the room with someone. It might just be saying, what can I do for you? And I think that to that same point with connection, I think for me, I've had to learn to not jump in and solve problems. Like I know that is not real connection.
Yeah.
It was a learned behavior based on things that I experienced in my life and how I thought people would value me personally. And what I've come to find is that the direct reflection of that in my own life is that I don't want people to solve my problems. Like sometimes I just want to
someone
be heard,
to listen, someone to hear it out. And I tell people all the time, like, you don't need to give advice here. You need to shut up and be a sounding board, and I say that probably 10 times a day, like stop trying to fix this person's problems for them. They need to figure out the solution or they're going to keep making these mistakes.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the biggest piece of it. I think when we get so disconnected from ourselves, you mentioned it earlier about the patterns that repeat in our lives until we learn that lesson. I mean, I can count several patterns that I repeated until I learned the lesson. And no one could have told me. You could have told me directly, this is what you're doing, this is how you're doing it, and you're going to do it 16 more times. And I would have blown it off because I had to figure it out myself. And it goes back to listening to your own intuition about things.
Absolutely. But in relationships, it's tough because sometimes it's not your pattern that needs to be corrected. Sometimes it's the other person's pattern that needs to be corrected. Sometimes you're with someone, you've done all the work, but they haven't, or they live in this place of fear, or they are not honest about, something going on, whether it's with you or it's their family or anything. Like, sometimes you get stuck in someone else's mud.
And it's really easy to take it on ourselves because we
Oh,
only know our
absolutely.
side
Who
of it.
doesn't want to make someone they care about's life easier, you know?
Mhm.
And I had to I had to learn this the hard way. And I've always been an action person. I've always been, and I had to realize that I can do that still, but I need to step back and, and just be there for people. Just be connected, be in the moment. I am the one that my friends run to when they need help, whether it's lifting a big piece of furniture or it's advice. I'm usually one of the first phone calls, and sometimes it's just asking the right questions. And that even in sessions, people are like, well, what do you mean? Like, no, just, I'm not asking you for details, but I will ask small questions about things to kind of get them to see what I see.
Being the person that everyone comes to when they need help, how do you make sure that you find the space to get the help and support that you need?
Well, my therapist I have a standing appointment every other week. So that's how I get it. I have really strong friendships. I have my mother, who is one of my best friends, she was the last person to text me before I walked in the door here just to say, did you actually was like, did you ever hear from Podcast Guy? Yeah, I'm on my way there. My sisters we are super close. I have a great support system, so I don't always put a lot of my stuff on them, but they're always there for me. Most of my friendships are lifelong, I find that to be especially in relationships, a red flag. When a person doesn't have a relationship with their family, that's not always a bad thing, because there are lots of toxic parents and siblings and things out there, and everyone's situation is different. But I look at the connections in their life, and that kind of makes me decide whether or not I want to pursue something, or I want to see what this connection is between me and someone else. Because if you don't respect people, if you don't, everyone says, oh yeah, if they're rude to the server on the first date. No, it's bigger than that. If every person in their life has just caused nothing but problems, then what's the common denominator? They are. Not everyone that you're going to come across, everyone in your life is a bad person. There are bad people out there, but you have to look at that. You have to look at the bigger picture.
I think that is such an interesting concept, because as you talked about it, when you start to be reflective of your own life and you start to look at the places that you need to take accountability for your choices, there's a balance between being able to go back and apologize or have that conversation. And there's also times where you can't do that, but you can always do better going forward.
I've been thinking about this particular situation. 2 years ago, I was in a great relationship. Everything was perfect. Everything seemingly was smooth. We had a lot of fun together, great chemistry, everything. And then he was, all of a sudden, his grandfather, who was suffering from dementia, was dying, and we're 3 hours apart. And I had to step back and say, you know what? I just need to let him know that I'm here. Normally, I would have jumped in the car and shown up on his doorstep. And I had to be the adult in the situation and say, you know what? I can't do that. I can't sacrifice my life to do this. And I said, hey, I'm here. What do you need from me? You got to, direct here a little bit. I get you've got a lot going on, but if you need me to get in the car, I'll get in the car. And that he went through a tough loss. And then, it was career and home, everything all at once. And I kind of had to step back and be like, all right. And I still wrestle with did I not do what was expected? Should I have jumped in the car? Should I have driven 3 hours to surprise him, to make his day, or to show him how much I cared? No, but I think about it. No, I think I did everything I could,
Mm-hmm.
And that relationship ended up not working because he was going through whatever, or who knows what what his explanation is. I struggle to this day with, like, did I make the right decision? And I feel like, no, you know what, I did. I let him know. I let everyone know that I'm here. If you need me, if you have access to me and you need me, I'm there for you. Most people don't have a phone that I don't carry with me. I guess, in a weird sense, my kink is helping people,
Yeah. I think when you can provide a service or an insight or value that allows someone to reflect on their own life, because I think the reflection is
people
important.
Happy. Yeah, at the end of the day, I like seeing people smile. I like seeing people feel confident. I like seeing people enjoy their life. And life is about the experiences, and I think everyone should enjoy it.
With everything we talked about today, especially enjoying life, what is the message that you want to leave people with?
Stop letting fear dictate the decisions you make. Trust yourself and put in the work. Most people avoid putting in the work until they can't get away with it anymore.
And that makes it even harder.
Yeah, of course it does.
What is something that someone has said to you that's impacted your life and you'll never forget?
I mean, I could take that in a million directions.
That's why I ask it the way that I do.
So one of the last stories with my grandmother, when after my grandfather passed away, I moved in with her, and she bought this cowbell. I was like 22 years old at the time. You were not putting a cowbell on my car keys, but I'm very light of foot, and I would come in from work, and like 6 o'clock would come and be like, all right, I'm going to go out and meet friends for dinner. And I'd like come bouncing down the stairs, and it would scare the shit out of her because she would have no idea that someone was home. She would, so she bought these bells for our car keys so we could hear each other coming in and out of the house. And to me, that was like embarrassing. I was like, I'm not walking around with this fucking chime on my, that everyone can hear from a mile away on my keys. And we went through this whole thing of like, I would throw it out. I would, and right before she got sick, I had a weird feeling that cancer was coming. And then the doctors said that they thought she had breast cancer. And she went through all the testing, and they came back and said, no, it's not breast cancer. And my family, celebrated, and something just still didn't feel right with me. And I had, would throw the bell out, and she'd put it back on my keys, and I'd throw it out and put it back on my keys. And one day she said to me, if you don't stop with this bullshit, I'm going to have it surgically attached to you. And after she died, I had a family tattoo done, my whole arm, and the bell, because it was a symbol to me that like she was always going to be there. Mm-hmm. And like one of those intuitive voices I hear has always been her. For me, certain connections in my life, certain losses in my life, like my grandfather, my grandmother, the voices got louder. It's like I knew I had. It's like when my grandfather passed, that was the first time I actually could acknowledge like spirit. Like I knew where it was coming from. When my grandmother passed, I was just starting to kind of let down the walls and talk to other people about things that I would hear, spirits, things. And when she passed, that got even louder. So having that tattoo done, like that saying, her saying that to me changed my perspective on what I do. Mm-hmm. And to this day, I mean, while she was, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer right after that, and it was a, crazy battle. I did throw out, while she was away on the celebration trip in between the breast cancer scare and the pancreatic, I did throw out the bell. She wasn't able to salvage it because it was gone well before she returned. But after she passed, I hung that bell in and it still to this day hangs from the rearview mirror of my car. Just a reminder that she's always there.
I can definitely relate to the connection with my grandparents, and I I love that permanent reminder. And I have one of my own. That's a fish hook on my arm with their wedding anniversary that so cool. I got right before they both started to get sick. And I think that we all have our unique ways of remembering, and sometimes it needs to be more permanent. But I love your interpretation of that question, because I think it's often not necessarily advice that's the thing that sticks with us and makes the biggest impact.
Yeah, it did. And even just the family tattoo is like, it's my grandfather's badge number, and like this, I was born on his badge number. So like it's I was a surprise. The doctors told my mother she had a bad gallbladder. Went into the hospital, the night before I was born, and at 8 a.m. my grandfather came back with my uncle to the hospital to be like, all right, it's my daughter out of surgery. And they were like, yeah, you have a grandson. And he was like, what?
Well, we could do a whole other episode on that.
Oh yeah, there's lots of those stories.
The connection to the badge numbers. Incredible.
And that was one of the big things. My grandfather at that point was like, kind of put his foot down and said to my family, like, his mother didn't want them to keep me. And, and my grandfather sat down and said, no, either we figure this out, or I'll take him, and you guys keep the businesses, and I'll take all the money, and I'll raise him myself. And those, after they were both gone, the tattoo was something, that I'm covered in them, but the tattoo for me was something important. It was like a constant reminder that these are the important people.
And your fiercest protector. Fiercest protector from day one.
Oh yeah.
Now we turn the tables, and you can ask me any question that you'd like.
What do you want to get out of this podcast, the whole experience?
I think for me, I have always enjoyed conversations, and I've always felt that hearing someone else's story or the things that they've been through is a way that we can connect to people when shared in the right way and in the right space. I want to create a space where someone could listen and take something away from the episode that would set them on a different path in life, because they heard something that was a direct connection to something that they were struggling with. And recently, I've been thinking a lot about social media and the podcast and the space for an hour conversation, because everyone's used to a 15-second, max 60-second scroll. Yeah. And I think for me, the podcast is a space that I want to create in a different way, where it may be one-on-one conversations now, but I want to have these conversations in a room of people. And I want to be able to bring a random person up on stage and just have a similar conversation to what we had now. Not in a way of pushing someone to talk about something they don't want to talk about, but I think that there are so many people that want to share their story and want to talk about what they've been through, but don't know how to create that space, or don't want to necessarily do it in a dynamic of, on social media or continuing with it, but having that conversation in a group of people on that specific day could help someone else in that room. And I think that I want to find a way to continue the podcast, but have it be more dynamic, where there's a group of 20 people here, and after we have our conversation, someone else comes up because something we talked about they felt connected with, and continue to build the podcast that way.
All right. Well, you make it really easy to talk. So
thank you.
You should keep doing it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I want to thank you for joining me today and sharing so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe or follow button, because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. And if today's episode got you thinking, laughing, crying, or maybe even rolling your eyes, write a review and tap to rate. Now let's be real. This convo doesn't end here. Hit us up on socials and don't be shy. Slide into our DMs. We love to connect. Thanks for hanging with us today, and catch you on the next one, because our journey together is just getting started. Remember, stay curious, live authentically, and keep turtzing it up.